Sunday we will begin looking at the books of poetry. And I think the cards are dealing with Job, Psalms, and Proverbs. And so for Sunday and Wednesday, we'll be looking at those three books. In fact, if we just read those three books, that would take up probably a lot of the time, wouldn't it? And so that's the way the things are broken down. Tonight we'll finish up the books of history. And how many books of history are they? 12. And dealing with the last three books that are listed in that category: Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. We looked at the book of Ezra Sunday morning, and when you're looking and studying that book, it can be broken down in this way: chapters 1 through chapter 6, dealing with the return of the people of God back to Jerusalem under the direction of Zerubbabel. And when they got back to Jerusalem, we noticed what they did. We have an altar being set up, and they began sacrificing and so forth. But also we see that they began to rebuild the temple. And so remember, the temple had been burned and Jerusalem had been destroyed when Babylon came in reference to the southern kingdom. And so they laid the foundation of the temple and began to build on the temple. But then opposition came about, and got to the point where people made a request of the king that that work on that temple be stopped. And it was. And so they stopped working on the temple for about 16 years. And they started back when Darius became king of Persia. Cyrus had given them the right to go back and to do that and to start on that work. He died. A son takes over, and then he's the one who decides to put a halt to that work, because he was being told, you know, Jerusalem is a place of treason, and so you need to stop this. And so he did. And so Darius now becomes king, and he has been requested by the people there to allow them to go back and start and to continue rebuilding. And they told him that Cyrus gave us permission. So he checked the chronicles, he checked the journals, he checked the records, and saw that to be the case. And so Darius then told them to go ahead and complete the temple. And that's what you're looking at, chapters 1 through 6. Then chapter 7 and onward, you're talking about the second group that went back to Jerusalem, and that was under the direction of Ezra. And there was restoring of worship. There was restoring of the law for the people during that time. And Ezra had to remind the people that the law that God had given to his people in times past is the law that they must adhere to. And he noticed that people had violated that law in many different ways. And one way was they were marrying people, even the priest, marrying people in the land. And so they were told you have to stop that. You have to get out of that. And so that's what God wanted them to do. Now, the book of Nehemiah was not a special person from the standpoint of being a priest or a prophet or king, anything like that. Nehemiah was just a cupbearer to the king. That's what he was. But Nehemiah was concerned about Jerusalem. And he had been informed from some who had been there about how, if you will, how bad it had become. And so Nehemiah was very upset with how things were going in Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah, he weeps and he prays. He weeps and he prays. He goes before the king in chapter 2. And the king sees that Nehemiah was very upset about something. And the king asked him about that. And so Nehemiah explained to him why he was so troubled and why he was sad about what had happened and what is happening back at Jerusalem. And he is going to make a request from the king to allow him to go back. So now we're going to have a third group going back to Jerusalem. And their purpose in going back is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And that's why Nehemiah goes back. When you read through the book of Nehemiah, especially the first 6 chapters, we're going to read about this wall being rebuilt. And after the wall is rebuilt, after a while, the Nehemiah goes back home. In other words, he goes back to and stays there for a while. Then he makes a second trip in chapter 13. And when he makes that second trip back to Jerusalem, he sees that things have gotten worse again. And things are really messed up, all kind of compromise. And they have set aside the Sabbath day altogether. And they're doing all kinds of things. And Nehemiah is going to point out to them what they need to do. Let me remind you that when you come to a reading of the book of Nehemiah, at the conclusion of that is basically a conclusion of Old Testament history. When you study the books of major prophets and the books of minor prophets, all those will fall into prior to the end of Nehemiah. Of course, you're going to read about Malachi during that period of time as well. But it all falls within that period of time. So you basically have the end of the Old Testament. If you're reading in chronological order, then when you get to the book of Nehemiah and the book of Malachi, then you're getting to the end. All the other prophets prophesied prior to the end of the book of Nehemiah. Again, I want to remind you, and I stated in class Sunday about the book of Esther. When you are trying to put that in chronological order. And I stated that when you come to the end of Ezra chapter 6, really from the end of Ezra chapter 6 to the beginning of Ezra chapter 7 is almost 60 years. And that's where the book of Esther is to be placed. And between chapter 6 of Ezra and chapter 7 of Ezra. Well, let's look at Nehemiah. And what I want to do is spend some time here looking at these first 6 chapters, especially. Then as time allows, look at chapter 13. And we're going to try to get to certainly the book of Esther, great book. And some great lessons can be learned certainly from that book as well. As we look at some main individuals, main characters that are found in the book of Esther. And so here Nehemiah has gone back to Jerusalem. And if you'll note, beginning in verse 11, verse 12 of chapter 2, Nehemiah is going to do a little searching out, if you will. Now, he's going to see clearly what some of the issues were in Jerusalem at that time in reference to rebuilding the walls. And as he does this, Nehemiah begins to think about some things, some plans that need to be put in place for them to rebuild that wall. And first of all, note please, he saw the need. He saw the need. And he wanted to do something about that. And so he spends time, number two, he spends time in prayer. And so now he's going to put in place here a plan by which they were to follow to get that wall rebuilt. And so he begins to secure some workers. You've got to have workers if you're going to rebuild that wall. Now, this is not going to be something that's going to be easy from the standpoint that everybody's going to be really for you in doing this. Remember, Samaritans still in the land, and they're going to cause some problems. And they do. In fact, notice in chapter 2, verse 10, when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly. There was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. They don't want that to happen, okay? They don't want that to happen. And so you note, beginning in verse 17. Follow with me, verse 17. Then said I unto them. He's talking about the workers that's going to help here in rebuilding the wall. Then said I unto them, ye see the distress that we are in. In other words, there's a problem here. I see that. Surely you see that. So let's do something about it. You know, to accomplish much, we need to understand where we are right now. So here's the issue. Here's the problem. And so he says to them that Jerusalem, of course, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Notice the exhortation. Let us notice the call for the people being united in rebuilding the wall, but also he is calling here for action on their part. This wall is not going to be rebuilt by itself. And so let us build up the wall of Jerusalem. And then notice verse 18. Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me. I'm here by the direction of God Himself. This is not something that I have just come up with. God is behind this. Again, when He says those words to the people, He is hopefully reminding them and encouraging them to step up to the plate. Okay? This is what God wants us to do. As also the king's words that he has spoken unto me. And the response of the people was, let us rise up and build. We see the need. We know the one who is behind all of this. And so there's no reason for us not to be involved. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. What they're about to do is a work that is good. And so they are ready They are eager. They see a need. So let's get to work. But when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem, the Arabian, heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, "What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king?" And so immediately, when the people in the land, talking about the Samaritans and so forth, heard about what Nehemiah and the people are going to do, they were mocked. They were ridiculed. They were scorned. Really, what do you think you're doing? Now, this was just the beginning. Now, notice how Nehemiah responded to that. You know, sometimes when people respond in a negative way towards something you know is a good thing to be done, sometimes you don't have to respond to that. Sometimes it's best just to go ahead and do the work. Don't worry about what anybody says. Now, sometimes when people respond in a negative way, then you need to respond as well. You remember in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, when the apostles were speaking in tongues to those people that were gathered there on that occasion. And some of the people said, "What? You men must be what? Must be drunk." Well, he couldn't. They couldn't let that go. They couldn't let that go. And what I want us to see here, just because somebody offers words of criticism doesn't necessarily mean you have to respond to it. But when they start attacking the power of God, you see, when they start attacking the truth itself, if they don't like something that I may particularly do, big deal. Okay. Oh, you don't like the tie that I wear? That's fine. You can still go to heaven. And so you can criticize if you want to. I don't like the way your hair looks. Okay, that's fine. I was born with this hair. It has changed color over the years, but I was born with this hair. And so if you don't like it, I'm sorry. Then you need to wear some sunglasses or something. I don't know what you need to do. And so get over it. Get over it. And so I'm talking about when people offer words of criticism, make sure, and now listen, because that person might be saying something can be helpful to you. Don't just reject it because the person in the past has offered some criticism, it wasn't any good. Well, this time it might be. Okay? Don't reject the criticism just because it comes from a certain individual or people. Because what they're saying now may be good. Maybe something beneficial to you. And so we're going to see this as you go through this, these words of criticism toward Nehemiah and the people. And then answered I them and said to them, "The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build. But ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem." You don't have anything to do with this. You can say what you want to. You got nothing to do with this. And that was his response. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he's going to, he's going to solicit here some workers and so forth, and he organizes them in a certain way and so forth, and he certainly encourages them throughout as they're building that wall, and as they began to building the wall and so forth. Now notice in chapter 4, Again, we're going to see some people upset, some of the same people again. But it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we build the wall, or was they're working on that wall, he was wroth and took great indignation and mocked the Jews. I'm sure they were really surprised at that. He mocked the Jews. And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, what do these feeble Jews? Now he's getting, these Jews are just a bunch of feeble people. They are weak. They can't do anything. They don't know what they're doing anyway. And so now he's getting a little more in an attack mode, if you will. But it's the feeble Jews. Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? Now Tobiah, the Ammonite, was by him. Of course, he's got to say something too. And he said, even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall. Tobiah said, let them build it. They don't know what they're doing. Even if a fox goes up there and leans against that wall, you know what's going to happen to the wall? It's going to come down. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. That's what he's saying. Here's the answer to that in verse 4 through 6. Hear, O God, for we are despised. Okay? Now notice verse 6. What do they do? Well, we got to stop. We got to stop building this wall because they're making fun of us, and whatever we build is not going to stand. That's not what they did. And sometimes what people do today when they begin something that know to be a good work, when words of criticism come, they say, okay, we got to stop. We got to stop. So built we the wall. And all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof. For the people, here's the reason why, for the people had a mind to work. Well, persecution comes. Verse 7, verse 8. People are talking about they're going to fight against them. Try to do what they can to hinder them. Verse 9, here's the response to that. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God, and we set a watch against them day and night because of them. We know there's people trying to keep us from building the wall. I said, we're not going to cover our eyes to that. We're not going to say, we need to be aware of what's going on. And when they were rebuilding that wall, had a weapon in one hand and a tool to build that wall in the other one. Today we understand that we do need to be watchful all the time. That certainly there's the devil who's active, who's busy. There are those who are servants of the devil. They're going to do what they can to hinder the cause of Christ. We understand that. So we have to be watchful. We have to be aware of what's going on. Verse 14. And I looked and rose up and said unto the nobles and the rulers, to the rest of the people, be not ye afraid of them. Remember the Lord. Jim talked about tonight how people forget the Lord. And that was one problem in the past of God's people. They were forgetting the Lord. Forgetting everything He'd done for them. And as he reminded us this evening, Jim did, about the fact that we as Christians, children of God, can forget. And that's a dangerous thing for us to do, is to forget the Lord and what He's done for us. When you look at 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 through 11, Peter points out one of the reasons why people do not grow spiritually as they should is because they have forgotten that they were purged from their old sins. That's what he said. They're not adding and abounding in the Christian graces. And Peter said one of the reasons why is because they have forgotten what God has done for them. When a person continues to remember every day what God has done for him, that's a person that's going to continue to grow as he should. But when we forget, in other words, we fail to remember what God has done, then we're going to start going backward. And so when you look at these things, whatever the people did there in the land and tried to stop and try to hinder them from rebuilding that wall, Nehemiah is ready. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go on. We're going to keep on. Why was he doing that? He was strengthening their hand, if you will, and their heart as they were working on that wall. Because you know how it is sometimes when problems arise, troubles arise, people can become discouraged. And so Nehemiah is reminding them over and over, whatever they bring, remember, God is with us and God is on our side. Now notice in chapter 6. Now it came to pass when, here's Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, the Arabian, and the rest of our enemies. So these three are not their only enemies. When they heard that I had built the wall, and that there was no breach left therein, though at that time I had not set up the doors upon the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, Come, let us meet together in some one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me mischief. So Sanballat and Geshem got a message to Nehemiah. They tried everything else to keep him from working on that wall. Let's have a meeting together. Just because people call you in for a meeting doesn't necessarily mean you ought to be willing to listen to what they have to say. And it says here, he knew what they were up to. See, anytime they stop and go into a meeting and sitting down and discussing things with your, first of all, your enemies, and that means you have lost some time in working on the wall. Many times the call for meetings is going to be a presentation of calling for compromise. Over the years, there have been some so-called, quote-unquote, unity meetings with members of the church and other religious groups. And basically, it's not a time in which it's to discuss what the differences are or what the Bible actually authorizes. It's basically a time in which we discuss about what we can sort of do together, and we're going to accept what you want to do, and you accept what we want to do, and so we're all okay. That's basically what those kind of meetings turn out to be. And that's the kind of meeting that's being called upon here. And basically Nehemiah says that is not happening. We're not going to stop working on this wall. The wall was finished. Notice in verse 15. So the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month, Edal, in 52 days. They built that wall in 52 days. From the time when they started working on the temple to the time which the temple was completed, how many years was it? 20. Of course, they stopped working on it for 16 years. But from the time it started to the time it's finished, 20 years. They built this wall in 52 days. Nehemiah is called back to the court of Artaxerxes, and he returns back. Spends some time there. Then in chapter 13, you read about his returning. And you can read through there about some things that he found. I want you to notice a name. And if you look at Nehemiah chapter 13, here's one thing he found that's very upsetting to him. And before this, Elisha, the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, the house of our God is the temple, was allied unto Tobiah. Tobiah now he's got a little sleeping over place there. And he's just been welcomed now in. And you remember old Tobiah, he's one of those three stooges. They're trying to do what they could to stop the wall from being rebuilt. Read through there about what happened. Now, the book of Esther. In 5 minutes, we're going to cover the book of Esther. If you just remember the main individuals in this book and remember what they did, then you have a pretty good idea what the book of Esther is all about. Begin to read this book. Who was Vashti, or Vashti, depending on where you're from, I guess. Vashti. Who was she? She was a queen, wasn't it? And her husband, the king, had this big party going on that lasted for 6 months. 6 months. 180 days. Pretty long time to party, isn't it? And then he invited certain people to come in for that. Then he had another little party going on, a banquet. And he invited everybody to that party. Everybody except the women. Called Vashti. Then she had a little banquet and invited all the women to come to her little get together. And while all these men were there partying, that means getting drunk and drunk and drunk and more drunk, and if you can get more drunk. And so the king thought it would be good. Now, during all this time, what the king is doing is really showing all these people the things he has. Look at all this stuff I've got. Now, if they could see it, but anyway, he's reminding people all the things he's got. And then it dawned on him, listen, I've got a beautiful woman. And he sent messengers over there to his wife and said, your husband wants you to come over here and be before all these drunken men. And Vashti says, that's not happening. I'm not coming. Well, this old king, he's the husband, and he expected his wife to do what he wanted her to do. And she says no. And so the king says, okay, if you're not going to do what I ask you to do, then I'm just going to get rid of you. So she's no longer serving as queen. Well, what happens then? Well, we begin to read about this man Mordecai. Mordecai really is the main character of this book, even though the book is named Esther. And we know certainly the part that Esther played in all this. We understand this. And so Mordecai, and he had a part in the kingdom there to the king, and certainly well respected. And here's this lady by the name of Esther. And in the Bible it says she was his cousin. If you read in some translations have her uncle. And but anyway, her cousin. And so her mother and father have died. And they're evidently when she was younger. And he took her in as basically as her daughter, his daughter. Now, the king is looking for someone to replace Vashti. He's looking for another woman to be queen. Well, you read about all that, about what happens here in chapter 2 and so forth. Now, when you get to read about this, we won't take the time to read it because we don't have time, first of all. And how it describes Esther and how beautiful, certainly, that she was. And so, when that process began, these ladies, they're referred to as virgins, that he was to take his wife from. They had to go through a purification process for 12 months. And after that period of 12 months, and he would invite one in at a time to spend with him. She would leave, another one would come in. She would leave. And the process began. So he was looking for someone to take Vashti's place. Verse 17, it says, and the king loved, this is chapter 2, and the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The latter part of chapter 2, read about some men getting together. They're plotting to do what? To kill the king. Mordecai hears about this. Mordecai tells Esther. Esther tells the king on the behalf of Mordecai. And so those two individuals are taken care of. And certainly the king is pleased about that. But nothing is done to show appreciation to Mordecai at this time. In chapter 3, read about this man by the name of Haman. And certainly he had a position among the king. Got to the point where he was promoted to being basically next to the king. And this man Haman loved that. That meant he could walk around and people had to bow down to him. And but then he ran across Mordecai one day. And Haman was expecting Mordecai to bow down to him, and Mordecai didn't do it. And Haman, of course, becomes upset, becomes angry. And so, Haman became angry because Mordecai would not bow down to him. So what did Haman want the king to do? Make a law to kill all the Jews. Not just take care of Mordecai. Joe and I were talking about this last Sunday night, how sometimes, you have an incident with, let's say, a policeman. Things didn't go well. And so sometimes people think, well, all policemen are rotten. Let's get rid of all of them. Or you have an encounter with a politician. You think, well, they're all evil. That may be an exception. I don't know. Maybe when you talk about politicians. But anyway, you have sometimes people generalize. It's difficult. One person does something. I just think, well, everybody's like that. Well, Haman is saying, let's get rid of all the Jews. I don't get rid of all of them. Well, the king made that law. And so, in fact, Haman says to the king, I tell you what, here's what I'm going to do. I know that's going to cost you some money, but I'll take care of it. I'm going to give into the treasure whatever we need when all these Jews are killed. Well, Mordecai lets Esther know, but Haman has got the king to make a law that all the Jews will be killed. Mordecai is a Jew. Esther is a Jew. Uh-oh. Now remember, Mordecai told Esther, don't let anybody know basically where you're from. When that whole process started about selecting the queen, Mordecai told her, don't let anybody know where you're from. Your nationality, don't let everybody know. She didn't. Now, what are we going to do? Well, Haman got to the point, as you remember, that this man Mordecai just makes him upset every time he sees him because he doesn't bow down to him. And what did Mordecai decide to do? What did he want to be built? Okay? Well, we're going to build some gallows here. We're going to take care of this man. Well, in the meantime, you know the account here about what happened concerning Esther and Mordecai. And when Esther was told by Mordecai, you need to go to the king. You need to tell him what's going on. She said, I can't. You can't appear before the king just because you want to. If you appear before the king without being invited, that means death. That means death. And if you appear before him, unless he raises his golden scepter, then whoop, you're gone. I'm not talking about going out of the building either. You are gone. And Mordecai reminds her, remember what this is going to do. And Mordecai, remember those words that Mordecai said to her about, who knows that you have not come to such a place as you're now in other words, to help the people of God to be delivered. Talking about the providence of God. Who knows? Who knows? The king cannot sleep one night, and so he asked for one of his assistants, if you will, to bring the chronicles in, the records. And that sounds like something really to keep you awake, don't it? But anyway, to bring in and start reading that, and it so happened, he began to read about what Mordecai had done in reference to saving his life. And the king asked, what do we do? What did we do to help Mordecai at that time? Nothing. Nothing. Now, Haman is getting ready to come in and see the king. And he wants to hang Mordecai, of course. And when Haman comes in to the king asks Haman, what should we do for an individual that basically I'm very well pleased with, and we need to honor him? What should we do? You can see old Haman. Let me think. What you need to do to help me? I mean, you just see it, and that's what he was thinking. The king is going to do something great for me, and he's asking me what he should do. And so he's talking about apparel and putting on certain apparel, about riding on a king's horse and all that kind of stuff. And that's what Haman told him. And then the king said, good. That's good suggestions. So go and do that for Mordecai. What? You can just see or hear him. You got to be kidding me. But he did it. Of course, he knew he had to. He did it. And of course, Esther, later on you read about Esther having this banquet for the king and for Haman. Again, Haman thought, well, this is pretty good. I'm the only one that shows up with the king. Nobody else is invited. Just me and her husband. I'm feeling pretty good. And of course, the king asked her, well, what do you want? Ask of Esther. I'll give you half of my kingdom, up to half of my kingdom. What do you want? In fact, he asked her, I think, 3 times altogether about that question. Then there's a second banquet they went to. And when he asked her about this, then Esther told him concerning Haman and what he is up to. The king could not revoke the law. Could not do that. The law was that they had a right to kill all the Jews. He couldn't revoke that law. But what he could do was make another law. And that law was that all these Jews, you have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to defend yourself. And they did. And they did. And at the conclusion of the book of Esther, read about how Mordecai was recognized and certainly how he was honored. And so now the Jews have been saved. So we see, as it talks about Sunday, we see the hand of God in this over and over and over. If Vashti had said, I'm not going to be there, she would not have been replaced. Esther could not have been queen. If the king had not been able to go to sleep that night, he would not have heard about be reminded of what Mordecai had done. And all that falls into place. And you see what happens. That's the book of Esther. Read it. Read it. You're just thinking, it's always read like a novel, it's like a story, isn't it? Just like an account. And when you read about what happened here in this book, you see God, as I mentioned to you, the word God is not in the book. The word worship, the word a lot of quote unquote religious terms, as you would call religious terms, are not found in the book. They're not there. Oh, you can blame Esther for the 10 minutes over. We'll start looking at Job, Psalms, and Proverbs next week. Brother J.C., will you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Father, we are so thankful for this time that thou hast given us to come together to study thy word, to learn more about thee, and to develop a deeper love for thee. Father, we are so thankful for the Old Testament. We're thankful for the teaching that's found within it. And Father, we're so thankful for the characters that we find within it also. We pray that as we study the Old Testament, that we will meditate upon the things that we learn. We pray, Father, that we will take it and we will hide those learnings in our hearts. And Father, we pray that the things that we study will help us to be more faithful to thee. Father, we are so thankful for our son Jesus. We're thankful for the hope that he gives us of eternal life. We're thankful, Father, for the sacrifice that he gave on our behalf. We're thankful, Father, for the blood that he shed that purchased the Church of Christ. And Father, we are so thankful for the love that he had toward us. We pray, Father, that each and every day that we will strive to do those things that will bring glory to thee. Father, we pray that we will strive to be more like thy son Jesus. We pray each and every day that we will let our lights shine in our communities. And we pray, Father, that much good will be done as a result of it. Father, we ask you to continue to be with us as we continue to grow and as we continue to do things that are pleasing in thine eyes. Father, we are so thankful for this congregation of thy people. We're thankful, Father, for our willingness to labor. We pray, Father, that we will continue to labor together. We pray that we will continue to love one another unconditionally. And Father, we pray that each and every day that we would continue to serve thee in a manner that would be found pleasing to thee. Father, we pray for those who were mentioned in the announcements. We ask thee, Father, to continue to bless them. We ask thee, Father, to continue to comfort them as only you can. And Father, we pray that we as brothers and sisters will be a source of encouragement to those that are going through some tough times. We pray that we will continue to encourage them and continue to lift them up. And Father, we hope and we trust that they will always find strength in thy word. Father, we are so thankful for Brother Jerry. We're thankful for his delivery of thy word. We're thankful for his presenting it in a manner that is simple, that we as the hearers, we can understand it and we can apply it to our lives. Father, we are so thankful for our elders also. We're thankful for the oversight that they provide us. We pray, Father, that they will continue to do those things that will help us to one day become citizens of heaven. Father, we also pray for their spouses. We pray, Father, that they will continue to encourage them to keep on. Father, we pray that we will not be a burden to them, but we pray that we will continue to encourage them as well. And Father, as we prepare to go to our separate places of abode, we ask that thou will put thy loving arms of protection around us and keep us from hurt, harm, or danger. And Father, we ask that as we repent and confess our sins to thee, that thou wilt forgive us. These and all blessings we ask in thy Son, Jesus'